Good morning and welcome to Let's Get Cooking. My name is Miss Jeannie and I'm glad you're here with me today. I'm excited. We're going to be actually baking today instead of cooking. Last month we made a wonderful soup, and this month we are actually making Scottish cranberry orange scones. And if you saw the beginning of this clip, it showed you a picture of them and some of the ingredients you'll need, which I have here beside me. And you will have seen a map of the world and where Scotland is, because we're going to talk a little bit about Scotland as we're preparing our scones. And so let's go ahead and get started. I'm glad again that you're with us. I wanted to start by showing you the book that I'm using. I checked this out at the library. There are many great cookbooks in the children's section as well as the adult section. And for those of you that are young and young at heart, I'd encourage you to look at both sections in the libraries. This one is called Baking Class, and I like it. It's easy to have open on your counter. There's a lot of fun things to read in the beginning to help you get used to and educated on the different kinds of terminology that we use as we're cooking and baking, as well as some of the tools or utensils that we use. There's a lot of great pictures of what they're supposed to look like afterwards, and if yours doesn't, just keep working on it. And what I did like too in the back here is there's stickers. So actually, if you made an item and you wanted to wrap it in saran wrap and give it as a gift, you could use one of these stickers. Now, we ask that you don't use them from the books in the library, but if you really enjoy this book, you can always add it to your birthday wish list, right? And get one yourself. And so there's a lot of different choices of things in the back here, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is this last page, which I thought was super fun, because you can actually pop them out and take the plastic off and see this heart here. Since we're in Valentine's Day, the holidays month of February, you can actually cut this out and it acts as a stencil. So if you were making the scones and you wanted to add just a little bit of powdered sugar over the top of them and make them more like for Valentine's Day, or maybe something sweet for just a gift for someone, you could use some of those stencils to do some different things with, put different sprinkles, or I always like powdered sugar. The one drawback of it is paper, and you probably wouldn't want to use it after one use unless you really cleaned it off well. So that is the book we're using, and make sure that you look at a lot of the different books that are available in the library, because there's some super fun ones like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I did prepare and put my items out like I mentioned to you in previous shows, and I preheated my oven. You just heard it beep because it's ready now. I preheated it to 425, which is a little hotter than we usually use for some of the other things we've cooked in the past or baked. But this is going to be 425. You're going to want to make sure that in the middle of your oven, you're going to use your middle rack. So if it's up too high, just take a look at the square inside of your oven if this is your first time using it. And make sure that you put the rack, or one of the racks that you're going to use today, in the very middle. And you want to do that really before you start your oven. That way it's not hot, right? If it's hot, you're going to want to use, you know what these are? This is an oven mitt, or something like that to move your things around inside the hot oven. All right, so we went ahead and preheated it. You're going to need a cake or a cookie sheet like this, or something similar, and I have that ready to go. I am not going to butter it or grease it. We're going to just leave it just as it is. The recipe says we're going to actually put the pastry or the scones right on top of it. So it's ready to go, just as it is. You may see that I have an extra block here of marble, and this is what I use when I'm working with pastry or when I need to maybe cut out cookies. There are mats you can use similar to this idea. You could also, if you don't have it, you can always use a piece of wax paper on top of your counter, because we're going to actually be working with dough, and we're going to be needing something to place it on in order to form it as the scone. So these are some of the preparing things you need to do for this particular recipe. So let's go ahead. We're going to start with, I've got a small bowl here, and we're going to start with our dry ingredients first, okay? And this particular recipe doesn't call for a lot of ingredients, and one of the reasons is that it's a very basic scone recipe. It's actually fun to go with basic, easy recipes for young at heart and young people, so they don't get too frustrated with too many things. So we're going to start with our flour. And so I have my flour here, and the recipe calls for 2 cups of flour. So let's go ahead and get our flour. Now you can use a sifter. I just kind of shake mine a little bit inside the bag. So here's 1. And 2. There is actually a lot of different kinds of flour out there. Maybe you have wheat flour. You can try that as well. But I'm going to just use the basic white flour here today. So here's our flour. It also calls for 3 tablespoons of sugar. And when I mentioned that it's not super sweet, this definitely is a lot lighter than most pastries. When I say the word pastry, do you get an idea of a couple things that you might be familiar with? One pastry would be a donut or a coffee cake. Those items have a lot more sugar in them. And so we're going to actually have a lot lighter sugar in these items. So we're going to put 3 tablespoons of flour. We are going to be adding some dry fruit, and that actually sweetens it up too. 2 and 3. So we have our flour and our sugar. And then it asks for 2 teaspoons of baking powder. So here is my teaspoon. Actually, I have a half a teaspoon here, so I'm going to use 2 of them. So 2 halves equal 1 whole, right? So here's a half. So we'll go 1 half. And the second half is going to make it 1 full teaspoon. One of the things you'll find is the more and more you bake and cook in the kitchen, you're going to learn a lot about fractions. And so this is a fun way to learn and get familiar with math, right? So we got 1 full teaspoon of baking powder. Do you know why we use baking powder? Baking soda or baking powder helps our pastry that we're making here today rise. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we form it out. So we have 3 items in here right now, and then the last of the dry is going to be a half a teaspoon of salt. So we'll put some salt in there. And you can mix it up a little bit. Just get everything mixed up. together with our spoon. Use any kind of spoon. All right. So this is what we call our dry ingredients for the pastry. Now we're going to be adding butter. And I have my butter here. It calls for a stick of butter or a half a cup. And we've talked about this before. On the side, you can always see on your stick of butter, it helps you with your amounts that you might need. Like 8 tablespoons is considered a half a cup. And so this is a half a cup. If we wanted a cup, we would need 2 sticks of butter. It also says, well, what I do with the butter is I take it out ahead of time and leave it on the counter. And the reason I do that is because cold butter is a little harder to work with, especially with small hands. But so I leave it on the counter for a little while before I bake so it softens up a little bit, so it's a little easier to work with. And I'm actually going to just cut them in chunks into my dry ingredients. So you can do that too. And then we're going to chop it up inside the dry. Now you might say, well, why don't we just pour it in, like heat it up and like warm up your butter. We don't do that because you follow your instructions carefully, because what happens is, depending on what you do with your butter, it can change the consistency of what you're baking. So today we're going to just use our room temperature butter, and we're going to put it inside our dry, and we're going to chop it up like that. And you can go ahead and do that, chop it all up. And let's talk a little bit about Scotland. Maybe you know a little bit about Scotland, and it's a European country. It is across the ocean from America. And do you know what their language might be? We talked about that, about Mexico and language last month. What do you think the primary language would be over there? If you said English, you were right. And what about the main sport? What do you think they like to play over there in Scotland? I'll give you a clue. It's the same thing that Mexico is most popular in. And if you said football, you were right. But guess what? Football there, as well as in Mexico, isn't the same as here in the United States. It's actually the sport of soccer here in the United States. So in Scotland, we might say, oh, they're playing soccer out in the field. And someone over there would probably correct you and say, nope, that's football. So those are 2 things that are interesting, I think, about Scotland. All right, so we have our butter, we have our dry ingredients, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to work on our liquid ingredients. Now right here I have a half a cup of milk. I use 2%. If you have whole milk, you could use that. If you try a different kind of milk, it may have a different taste to it, but just use what you have as far as milk. So this is a half a cup of milk. I'm actually going to grab a fork out, and we're going to take 1 egg. And so we'll put, I figured I would just put it right here inside here to make less dishes, right? That's always been my motto, less dishes. All right, so the recipe calls for whisking your egg inside your milk. Now you might have a whisk, which we've talked about that before. That's another tool that you can have in your kitchen, or you can just use a fork. And the main thing is just to make sure that your egg is completely mixed in with your milk. All right, so let's just make sure our egg and milk are completely, and that's what's fun about this step by step. It actually does show you what that will look like as far as mixing it up. All right, then we're going to actually add this to our dry ingredients. Now I'm going to keep my fork, and I'm going to use my fork to actually mix this in really well together. And it's going to start to make a consistency of, let's see here, it's going to thicken up into a dough. And we want to get it mixed pretty good. And I'm so glad I'm wearing an apron because I just threw a bunch of stuff on myself. That's okay. So you can use this. I'm just doing this because I have butter in here, and the fork actually works pretty good. If you feel like it's not very helpful, you can always switch. The main thing is to get familiar with different pieces of equipment. And now that I've got it pretty well as a dough, I'm actually going to switch just because I want to make sure I scrape the whole bottom and the sides to make sure that they also get the liquid into them. And then we're going to pull it out. And you can take a look at what this dough looks like. And I'm seeing a lot of loose on the bottom, so I really want to make sure that I get it all. Okay, so this is our basic dough we're going to use here. It's kind of like Play-Doh, only a little tastier, don't you think? Or it will be. It's very soon. Now before I pull it out, we're going to actually add a couple more ingredients, which you might have said, well, what are we, I thought it was called cranberry orange scones. And I would have said, yep, you're right. Because now that the dough is ready, we're going to add those. And so I have my dried cranberries, and I have a fourth of a cup of dried cranberry that I'm going to add to it. And I'm going to also add some orange zest. 1 teaspoon of orange zest. So let me just put that aside for a second and show you something. Here is my orange, and you might say, well, what is orange zest? If you don't have an orange and you don't have orange zest, you can make this recipe with just your cranberries. Or maybe you say, well, I don't really like cranberries. First, I'd say, try it first. If you have never had a dried cranberry, you might be surprised. You might really like it. If you don't have cranberries, you could always, what else could you add? Think about this a little bit. Could you throw chocolate chips in it? Yes, you could. It'd be a lot sweeter scone, but people do put chocolate chips in scones. I wouldn't necessarily mix cranberry with chocolate chip, but maybe you might like that too. You could add, how about raisins? You could make a scone with raisins. One of my favorite scones, other than this one, is blueberry. Blueberry scones are very, very good. And maybe you want to chop up apple and put some pecan nuts in it. That might be a nice variation too. So boys and girls, and those of you young at heart, even though we're doing this particular recipe, understand that you can get as creative as you want. But I hope you start with this one. So we have our cranberries, and now I'm going to add the orange zest. Well, how do you make orange zest? Well, I brought these two out to just show you. These are my graters. One is bigger than the other. The smaller one took a little bit longer, but I actually do have two sizes inside here. And I grated it over my little bowl, and now I grated the outside of the orange, which is totally full of essential oils and taste. So this is actually going to make you will taste the orange inside this recipe, even though it's a very small amount. And so that is, and then you want to always make sure that your oranges are washed really well too. So make sure that you scrub them good before you start to grate them. So I have my teaspoon of orange zest that I'm going to add to there. I'm going to set these aside since I'm done with them. And bring this back, and we're going to mix it again. We're just going to make sure that our cranberry and our orange zest gets in here. Along with having a nice clean counter and space to work in, you're also going to want to make sure that your hands are washed well. And we've talked about that a lot, but I don't want to miss that, because the next step that you see me do is going to be important that your hands are washed. And I'm going to actually pull up my sleeves here a little bit too, because I'm going to actually take my dough out of my bowl and I'm going to knead it. And kneading is maybe a new terminology for you, and it's actually where you take dough out and you squish it together like this. And I'm going to make sure I have every little bit that I can from my bowl. Set that aside. And want to make sure that my cranberry and my zest are well distributed in my dough. Now we don't want to knead this too much, just a little bit, because the more you knead it, the tougher the dough can actually be as far as taste. So we want it to be light and airy a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of flour to my board here. That just helps it not stick. And I'm going to put my dough on here. And we're going to push it out a little bit, like that. It's wiggling. And if you notice, I have another tool on the counter here, and it's actually a pizza cutter. Most people have them, right? If you don't, you can always use a sharp knife. And I'm going to cut these just like I would a pizza. I'm going to cut them in halves first. Actually, and then I'm going to cut them again. You can cut them into 8 like I am, or you can cut them into 6, depending on what size you want. All right. And I'm going to take them just like this and set them on my board. Isn't this fun? I'm not seeing a whole lot of cranberry on that one, so I'm going to actually stick one in the top. All right. And then do you know what the next step's going to be? We're going to put it in the oven. You were right if you said that. All right. So what do you think so far? They are going to get a little bit bigger than this. So I just kind of was pushing them down just a little so that they will evenly cook. All right. And we'll stick them in the oven in the middle rack. And the recipe says that we're going to actually bake them for 15 to 18 minutes. So I'm going to set my timer, which you want to make sure that you learn to use this, because there's nothing worse, really. Well, I guess there can be things worse, but one of the worst things that could happen is to spend all this time and money putting these together and have something burn. That would be terrible. So what you want to do is make sure that you use a timer, because it's easy to miss looking at the clock. So make sure you use a timer. I put it at 15, and we're going to come back and take a look very soon. Okay, we are back. I ended up needing about 16 minutes for my scones to be done, and you can see them here. I've had them on the oven, on the stovetop for a few minutes. Because I cut them in 8s, I think it took a little bit less than the 18 minutes. So if you end up cutting them in 6s, understand they're going to be a lot bigger than this. And they may take that full 18 to 20 minutes depending on your stove. And I always go for the lighter side, because stoves sometimes are a little bit different in their heating. So I waited until the bottoms were a little bit starting to brown a little bit, and these were perfectly done. Now I'll show you them. They aren't absolutely perfect, which is just perfect. I don't want them to be perfect. I want them to just be tasty, right? Well, we definitely want them to taste good. So I'm going to go ahead and put one on a plate here. I'm going to go ahead and take this one, because actually it does look probably the nicest out of all of them. And they did not stick. They moved very easily on my pan here, which is very fun. You never know when you're making something how it's going to turn out. So it turned out really well. And this is how big they turned out. They did raise a little bit. I noticed after I was done that I had said 2 tablespoons of baking powder, and I only put 1 in. How many of you caught that? That sometimes happens. Even when we're videotaping, it's like, wow, I made a mistake. And so boys and girls, I actually did make a mistake. I only put 1 teaspoon of baking powder in this recipe, and it called for 2. Is that going to be terrible? Well, I don't think so. They turned out just fine. So, but just in case you caught that, sometimes even teachers make mistakes. So my scone came out great. I also cut up my orange, and I have some cranberries here. And that's always fun. You could dress up your plate maybe you were going to serve this for a breakfast for someone, and you wanted to put maybe two pieces of orange and a couple of cranberries. These are dried cranberries, and doesn't that look pretty? And then maybe what else would you want with your scone for breakfast? Maybe a cup of tea, since this is very popular over in the European countries. Many of them have a cup of tea in the mornings or in the afternoons when they might have a scone. But in my house, it would be a cup of coffee, because I like coffee. So, but I'm going to go ahead and put this down. The consistency of it is pretty flaky, and you don't need a fork. You could just pick it up and try it. So I'm going to taste it right now. It's very good. They're warm, and they're not at all super sweet. They're just perfect, actually. So I would encourage you to cut our dough up like we did it in pieces of 8. If you wanted it to be just a little bit more sweet, you could sprinkle a little bit of powdered sugar over the top. But otherwise, I would just serve it just like this. And I wanted to mention a couple other fascinating facts about Scotland to you. I was really surprised at this, and maybe you know what the national animal is. The national animal in Scotland is. It is the unicorn. I thought that was kind of funny or fun, right? And then the other thing I came across, and it's been a long time since I actually heard or talked about this, was the Loch Ness Monster. Have any of you ever heard of that before? That would be a fun project to do for you in school, is some of the history behind sighting, that there was a sighting, they said, in one of the lakes in Scotland. It happened in Scotland. I didn't realize that it happened in Scotland, but that they saw this creature and they called it the Loch Ness Monster. And many people believe it's just a fable, that it's not true. But there are some people out there that scratch their head and wonder, is it possible that there is a creature like the Loch Ness Monster in the lake there? We don't know. Or maybe someday we will. I don't know. So that was kind of a fun, fascinating fact about Scotland. So I hope you learned a little bit about Scotland and had a little fun with that, and that you enjoyed making the scones. And I'd love to hear. You can always make a note on Facebook site if you'd like, and let me know if you made it or something like it, and if it was fun or not, if you had a disaster. And trust me, those of us that work in the kitchen, we have our disaster stories too. Boys and girls, and those of you young at heart, I've really enjoyed doing these with you and hearing some of the stories that some of you have shared with me. This is actually my last filming here, and so I've really looked upon all of these as just a really fun activity, and I hope you did too. The library is gearing up to open up to live programming, and so you should be able to plug into some new programs. Miss Sarah is great in the children's program department, and she has some wonderful things if you wanted to learn how to play a ukulele, or there's new crafts coming through, and just all kinds of exciting things. This summer, you'll find me in the garden. Otherwise, I'm actually transitioning. I'm going to be at Wilmot High School, working with the students there, and I'll be back in the summers at the library working in the garden, because I've been gardening, doing the main gardening for the last couple years. So you'll see me there. And again, it's been fun, and I hope you have had fun too. So boys and girls, and those of you young at heart, have a wonderful day. Bye.